Peggy Cundell's worst fear was that a debilitating stroke would consign her to a lingering, undignified death in a nursing home. It almost came true.
She had 2.5 years, I believe, of living hell. When she was awake, a lot of that time, she was crying and screaming. And our mother was a gently spoken, a very softly spoken woman. She was not a screamer, which I believe that in the end she was known as in there.
Great fish sandwich. Very nice.
Peggy Cundell had had a long and rich life. She loved new ideas, music and her garden. Her daughters say during the 1930s she was reputed to have the best legs on the entire Queensland Gold Coast.
She did, and we've been told that we've inherited them.
I don't think either of ours are as good as hers.
Not as good as hers.
Her family say how Peggy Cundell became a nursing home screamer is not a sad tale of inevitable human decline. Rather, it's one of a systematic failure to respect a patient's wishes. Peggy Cundell had an order declining extraordinary treatment measures, commonly called a do not resuscitate order. After her stroke, the family insist it was ignored. 730 has spoken to the hospital and they dispute that, saying Mrs Cundell's treatment did not involve resuscitation. Whatever occurred in this case, experts believe on too many occasions patients' wishes are not followed.
I think we are still within an imbalance of power within medical systems, but I don't think we've got any statistics about this sort of thing. It's a very important issue and we should be taking it more seriously.
Then, in the nursing home, her children felt too much emphasis was placed on the possibility of a rehabilitation and not enough on their mother's immediate comfort.
We were asking these questions of her doctors and also the nursing home, and they weren't coming up with answers for us. That the bottom line is you just have to sit there and watch your mother suffer. And we were absolutely beside ourselves. It was incredibly traumatic for us witnessing our mother's trauma and witnessing the change from a dignified, beautiful woman to a woman who was stripped of all dignity.
After 2.5 years, should she still have been like that?
No. You know, she should have been kept more comfortable. Well, whose needs are we meeting? And are we meeting Peggy's needs? And why didn't somebody in the early days ask Peggy what did she want? She was still able to communicate.
Against the advice of the nursing home, Peggy Cundell's children had her discharged. They took her out of the home and brought her back here to her own home, near her own garden and into her own bedroom.
It was absolutely exactly what she wanted and we were so grateful. She never screamed or cried again.
With the help of palliative care nurse specialist Joy Nugent, Peggy Cundell was looked after in accordance with the state's 25-year-old Palliative Care Act, one of the first in Australia.
It gave the patient the opportunity to refuse treatment of any kind that is life-prolonging. It gave doctors the opportunity to give effective symptom control without being accused of killing the patient, even if in fact doing that symptom control with powerful drugs did seem to accelerate the death of the patient. It wasn't done to kill them, it was done to make them comfortable, and that Palliative Care Act makes it perfectly clear that that's right. You've got that thing for me to sign?
Yes,
Professor Ian Maddox helped craft that law. 25 years on, he says it's not comforting nearly as many people as it should.
The trouble is palliative care has been given these capital letters. It's special and it's put in for people with cancer particularly, but it is something for everybody and it ought to be operating no matter where people are dying and whatever they're dying from.
The nursing home never offered palliative care. The 4 GPs who were looking after Mum never offered palliative care. They never mentioned the word.
Ian Maddox is far from alone in arguing that palliative care arrangements are not working properly. 4 years ago, in a report that went to Parliament, it was found legislation covering patients' wishes, known as advance directives, is overly complicated, often leaving hospitals and nursing homes in the dark. It still hasn't been changed.
We believe that with those recommendations in place, more people would actually have advance directives so that when the crisis comes, the person's own wishes are very clear, whatever those wishes are.
And he says 18 months ago the Health Department laid out new end-of-life guidelines for doctors and patients. They still haven't been released.
And I think if they were released tomorrow, there would be many situations currently where there's uncertainty about what to do that would be clarified.
We are all going to die. None of us are getting out of here alive. We just need to look at how we want to go.
When Peggy Cundell's children were youngsters, she would sing them a song about a golden boat. At her memorial a few weekends ago, her children sang it for her.
Here I float in our golden boat, flies and all, flies and all.
A week after coming home, Peggy Cundell floated away, surrounded by her family. There was no screaming, just the boat song. Her children want other families to know what a gift that was, and they want the aged care and health systems to deliver it.
We were on the shore and we were pointing her off in her golden boat on her way, and we couldn't go the whole way with her, but we could help her on her way, and we were just there to wave goodbye.
Just endless suffering, isn't it, Mum?
It wasn't supposed to come to this for Peggy Cundell, left babbling after a debilitating stroke. The sort of person whom her family says becomes known as a nursing home screamer.
Mum had a great fear of this sort of thing happening. She had an advance directive in place so that it would ensure that she wouldn't end up in a nursing home. And I think really all her fears came to fruition.
Last year, 730 South Australia documented Peggy Cundell's story. It looked at how advanced care directives, which lay out a person's wishes should they become incapacitated, can be overlooked. It examined why palliative care, in the view of the experts, still isn't widely understood and practiced.
It's put in for people with cancer particularly, but it is something for everybody, and it ought to be operating no matter where people are dying and whatever they're dying from.
We were absolutely beside ourselves. It was incredibly traumatic for us witnessing our mother's trauma and witnessing the change from a dignified, beautiful woman to a woman who was stripped of all dignity.
Finally, Peggy Cundell's family removed her from the nursing home where they were unhappy with her care and took her home. 4 days later, Mrs. Cundell had the death her children felt she deserved.
It was absolutely exactly what she wanted, and we were so grateful. She never screamed or cried again.
But that wasn't the end. In fact, it was more of a beginning.
I think that my mother would want me to do this in her memory, I suppose, but so that her suffering wasn't in vain, and it will help other people who are in similar situations.
Annie Hughes started writing letters and making complaints over her mother's care, and she's had some success. 2 weeks ago, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency had this to say about the medical practice that was responsible for Mrs. Cundell's care in the nursing home.
It appears insufficient information about Mrs. Cundell and her treatment was shared with those involved, which appears to have impacted on her continuing care.
The agency also found
on a number of occasions, Mrs. Cundell was agitated and distressed, and the doctor responsible for her care was aware of this.
And I think this is a wonderful outcome, and I'm very, very happy and very glad that that decision has been achieved.
They are not findings of wrongdoing, more how things could be better done. The board says it's now invited the medical practice to have training in the management of patients in the aged care sector who have had a stroke. But a separate complaint about aspects of her pain management at the nursing home to the aged care complaint scheme hasn't been so straightforward. At first, it was rejected, on the basis the events raised occurred more than 12 months prior to the complaint and were not ongoing as her mother was deceased. That decision's now been overturned by the Aged Care Commissioner, who's recommended the scheme investigate the family's complaints. And the representative body for nursing homes thinks that's a good result.
I think that's totally appropriate. I think that what we need to be sure here was that there's no systemic problems within the system, and that there's a consequence of that investigation, that we can make sure that that sort of situation that occurred there doesn't occur again.
The decision by Peggy Cundell's children to fight on is welcome news for the man who's effectively the father of South Australia's Palliative Care Act.
So palliative care got a sort of a picture as a specialty, and only special doctors, special nurses can do palliative care. No, we all should be good at palliative care. So palliation is everybody's business.
But business for nursing homes, Ian Maddox says, is tough on a number of fronts. For a start, it's hard to get doctors in to treat residents. There's not a lot of money in it.
I have great admiration for people who work in nursing homes because they are running. The number of staff per head of patient, is relatively small. They can't do very much except sort of keep people clean and fed and to move on. And that's really quite difficult to see sometimes. There's another problem in that many of the staff nowadays are young people from Asia, and they don't relate all that easily, I think, to some of the old people who've come out of the South Australian background, for example.
It's certainly fair, I think, in the context of people, chasing their tail. It's incredibly busy within an aged care facility. In relation to the palliative care issue, we've got to be very conscious of the fact that we don't have necessarily a lot of specialist skill within some of the workforce. That's a little bit variable depending on the facility that you talk about. And your second part of the question about the multicultural nature of the workforce, yes, that's a challenge, I think. It's certainly a challenge that the sector's fronting head on.
Money, or the lack of it, is critical. He says nursing homes get about 1/3 of the funding for the palliative care work they do compared to hospitals. And the community has a vested interest in that because, with any luck, we'll all one day grow old.
We don't have any hope that we're going to live forever, but as far as our final days are concerned, we should have a hope that it will be done well.
And it needs to be highlighted. We're all going to die, and I would hate to be treated the way my mother was treated if I end up in a nursing home.
For Annie Hughes, this is her livelihood. It's also her home and at times a haven.
It's been a relief to have this to go to just be in a garden property setting, and with all the stress that went on with my mother in so much distress herself in the nursing home, to be able to come back here and just have mental relief, I suppose.
She's needed that because when she hasn't been herding sheep, Annie Hughes has taken on the nursing home and aged care system over her mother's treatment.
Well, this is an extraordinary story, but for the amazing forensic persistence of Annie Hughes and her family, the truth wouldn't have come to light.
730 SA started documenting the story in 2012. A severe stroke had left Annie Hughes' mother, Peggy Cundell, unable to verbalise her physical pain, reduced to screaming and babbling. At its core, this is about why palliative care is not better understood and practiced in nursing homes. That shortcoming meant, despite a directive outlining her end-of-life care wishes, Peggy Cundell became, in her family's words, a nursing home screamer.
Sadly, it's not an uncommon scenario in aged care facilities. Palliative care, particularly end-stage palliative care, is not resourced to the extent that it should be.
Eventually, the family brought Mrs. Cundell back home to die.
She never screamed or cried again.
12 months after her mother's death, Annie Hughes complained to the Aged Care Complaints Scheme. Initially, the scheme refused to investigate, citing the time delay and saying Mrs. Cundell's death meant there was no ongoing issue. The Aged Care Commissioner overruled that. Using the nursing home's notes, the first investigation found nothing amiss.
It said that the nursing staff did a very good job and my mother wasn't screaming and wasn't in pain.
And that simply wasn't true.
That simply was not true.
But Annie Hughes had kept her own notes, documenting her mother's treatment and behaviour. Using those, a second investigator made completely different findings.
I don't think anyone expected Annie to be keeping her own notes and to be able to prove the holes, because it just happens too often that things get written and not done.
The aged care complaint scheme failed this family.
Just a few of the second report comments are as follows.
There is a lack of evidence to show staff adequately assessed Mrs. Cundell's pain. The evidence shows prior to the 15th of April 2010, staff rarely administered PRN analgesic medicine, even though staff did not recognise Mrs. Cundell's distress, may have been a sign of her pain. The evidence confirms that the service failed to meet the palliative care needs of medication was administered either for agitation or for anxiety, and not for pain.
That last finding is crucial.
The pain caused her behaviour, and it was just her behaviour that was being treated. So her screaming out and her upsetting other patients and being difficult, whereas they've realised in the findings that she actually was in pain and the pain wasn't being treated.
730 SA asked a specialist who helps nursing homes to meet government accreditation standards to read the report. He says part of Mrs. Cundell's treatment was a class of drugs known as benzodiazepines. They're sometimes called chemical restraints because they treat behaviour. They have a legitimate place, but under particular circumstances.
Based solely on the information that I've had in relation to the report, the use of benzodiazepines was not inappropriate, but it would have been more appropriate had they been used in conjunction with a proper pain management program.
And if there'd been a proper pain management program, she may not have needed the benzodiazepines.
It's possible that they could have reduced or eliminated them altogether, yes.
And why is that desirable, not to use or to eliminate benzodiazepines?
You try and use as least medical drug intervention, and particularly benzodiazepines, as possible. They do affect how a resident can interact with the environment around them.
Peggy Cundell was in Hillside Lodge, which at the time was run by Masonic Homes. The company declined to be interviewed. Hillside Lodge is now owned by a separate, unrelated company, which the report says has improved the monitoring of pain management. The report does not identify any one individual or groups of individuals as having failed. There is no criticism of Masonic Homes' management of the facility. It may sound strange, but in a way that suits Annie Hughes's larger purpose.
I'm not out for anyone's scalp, and I'm not aiming to point fingers at anyone in particular, but what I think it's revealed is that there are fundamental problems in the nursing home system.
Much of that revolves around how nursing homes are funded. Palliative care nurse Joy Nugent helped bring Peggy Cundell home to die. In her view, government regulation is forcing nursing homes and their staff to put compliance above compassion.
There's so much to do with policy and procedures, and when you go through an accreditation process, which you need to do to get government funding, you have to tick all the boxes, as it were. And nurses tell me and carers tell me that they're so busy ticking boxes that they don't have time to do the bedside care and treat people as people, you know, with love and compassion and laughter and happiness.
To quote John Howard, this is going to be the barbecue stopper in the next decade as more and more senior citizens end up in nursing homes and not getting the level of care that they deserve. It relates to a funding model and a compliance model that I think, if not being broken, is well on the way to being broken, and we actually need some fundamental reforms in relation to that. I think it's fair to say that some nursing homes are not allocating their resources as well as they could with the funding that they receive, but also the whole issue of funding needs to be reviewed.
And according to Peter Vincent, what they'll find is not a system run by rogues, but a tyranny of paperwork, tying good people up in the office rather than at the bedside where they belong. In one sense, this is the end of Annie Hughes' quest. It is, however, not the end of the story.
Peggy's circumstances should be a lesson for the new government, for the bureaucrats and the way the system operates. That's why I'll be raising it in the Senate estimates process.
I know she's just one person, but I know she would think that if her suffering can help others, that she would be all for it. I think we're just a step on the way.